Travillian Next is hosted by the Travillian Group. Please visit www.travilliangroup.com to learn more about our specialty in the placement of board members, C-level executives, and other professionals from the crossroads of community banking and fintech.
Okay, well, welcome. I am Brian Love, the head of depository recruiting here at the Travillian Group. We are engaging here today in another episode of Travillian Next, where we profile some of the innovators and game changers in the community bank and fintech space. I'd like to introduce our guests. First and foremost, we have Erin Fonté, partner at Hunton Andrews Kurth. Welcome, Erin.
Thanks, Brian. Good to be here.
Terrific. And also we have Dara Tarkowski from Actuate Law. She's a managing partner there and host of her own podcast, Tech on Reg. Welcome, Dara.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Pleasure having you both. Also, I'm joined with my esteemed colleague, Keith Daly, also of Travillian. Nice to see you, Keith.
Good afternoon, Brian.
Well, terrific. So it's great to have two legal minds on the program today to get into just a cornucopia of different topics. And we were all chatting before the call. I guess the first question is kind of a loaded one. It's in this landscape that we're in, it's probably changing more than ever in 2020. Community banks are searching for better ways to service existing clients, as well as the pondering of partnership with vendors and fintechs, which is something you both know extremely well. What's the importance of having legal counsel like yourselves with this deep subject matter expertise like yours? Erin, I don't know if you want to start that out.
Yeah, sure. And just a little bit of background on me. I'm the co-head of the Financial Institutions Corporate and Regulatory Group at Hunton. I'm resident in the Austin office, and our team works with probably over 100 different community banks across the country on a lot of these issues with regards to technology issues, third-party partners, strategy. With the community bank space, we also have the great good fortune of we work with probably 8 to 10 of the community banks that are partner banks or platform banks. There's about, I would say, around 35 banks in the country that are actually doing a deeper relationship with fintechs, and these are the banks that are banking products like Chime and Square Cash and things of that nature. So we kind of live and breathe right in that bank operations and technology space where we are talking about everything from core vendors, your Jack Henrys, FISs, Fiservs of the world, to new and innovative products that the banks want to add into their product offerings to offer to their own customers, all the way to community banks that are partnering with these deep partner and program manager relationships that kind of take the involvement in fintech to a whole other level. We are working with some of the banks. We're working with a bank that the head of innovation there was named Digital Banker of the Year last year by American Banker Association. And I also feel that in my personal practice with my smaller team, we're working with community banks. We're also working representing fintech clients. So we certainly see things from the other side with those fintech clients looking to partner with financial institutions. And finally, we work really deeply with retail, along with our firm's privacy and data security group headed by Lisa Soto, on all these retail related issues regarding innovation and digital, and obviously post-COVID, a lot of movement on contactless payments and other things that retailers can do to innovate. So I feel that we're in the unique and very great position to kind of see how everything is playing out over the ecosystem. And, I've been doing fintech before it was called fintech. So I've been doing this for about 17 years. And they just called us the bank operations people or the tech geeks of the banking group. And lo and behold, we've become a little more central to the conversation and strategic planning for our community banking clients.
Well, those tech geeks are the ones that are going to make community banks relevant for the next decade or two. So,
right.
God bless you. Dara, did you want to chime in, maybe introduce yourself fully and opine?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Dara Tarkowski, and as Brian said, I'm the managing partner at Actuate Law, which is a boutique firm here in Chicago, Illinois. I started the first 12 years of my career in big law, 2AM Law 100 law firms, where I had sort of a hybrid litigation and regulatory practice, very, very focused on financial services generally. The past 7 years or so has been much more focused on really all things at the intersection of law, technology, and highly regulated industries. So obviously that encompasses financial services, but it's also sort of broader than that. The firm has launched a RegTech subsidiary called CoinTech, where we actually build technology to automate the delivery of legal and compliance advice, because, God bless lawyers out there, but the billable hour is not something that clients are a fan of, or frankly, that I'm a fan of. So part of what we're doing is frankly cannibalizing of my own work. But we think that especially for, smaller and mid-sized financial institutions, FinTechs, startups, compliance is so mission critical and integral to the successful business operations, particularly as everything is moving so rapidly. I wanted to be, frankly, doing the same cool things that my clients were doing. So utilizing, the combination of legal and compliance and regulatory expertise and using the power of technology to create better, faster, and more consistent outcomes for clients on the compliance side, utilizing technology, but still having like your comfy security blanket of your lawyer behind you is something that we're very focused on. So I represent clients all throughout the financial services ecosystem, banks and non-banks, a lot of fintechs, a lot of startups, and a lot of really innovative technology companies that are sort of on the other side looking to engage with banks, partner with banks, and who, want to make sure that they're following the rules.
And yeah, Dara, on top of that, I think the first time we spoke was a couple months ago, and you're kind of, I remember you mentioned saying you're kind of the grease of the wheels to help them. You're working with these innovators, big thinkers, want to get it done. And you like to say, I don't say no, I like to say this is how we can do it. Is it tough kind of working with those big minds that just want to jump in?
Yes and no. So, I mean, I think we've all, and I'm sure Erin could attest to this too, have those clients who want to, who want to push, who have big ideas, who want to, get their business initiatives off the ground, and oftentimes see legal or compliance as obstacles to that. I don't ever want to be viewed as an obstacle to helping my clients get done what they want to get done. So when I called myself sort of the grease, it's like, I'm not saying no, it's sort of maybe a not yet, or maybe it's this is sort of what we need to tweak. And, we were chatting earlier about the notion that so much of the evolving technology landscape right now are these big and new ideas. There aren't really rules. Where are the guardrails? What do companies need to do to protect themselves? And when you're talking about new companies with new business models and products, I don't have the luxury, neither does Erin, of always saying this is exactly what you can do and this is exactly what you can't do.
Right.
And it's really all about understanding and having counsel who really gets the technology behind what you are trying to do and saying, this is how we can do it in the most defensible way possible, knowing what we know right now. There is never going to be a perfect rule or statute necessarily on the books that's going to give you some green light or rubber stamp and saying everything you're doing is perfect. It is about, however, looking at precedent, prior business models, what do regulators really care about? Are you thinking about consumer protection? And all of those things wrapped together, saying, if I can come up with defensible explanations and other protections that we can put into place to effectively get you where you want to be, that's what I'm going to help clients do. It's not an insurance policy. It's not a rubber stamp. It's really about having an appreciation on both sides, both from the innovation and technology and development standpoint, and then a respect for the regulations.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree
100%.
100% with what Dara was saying. I think what's interesting is we find ourselves, especially with our fintech client base, doing a lot of education about, hey, you're a fantastic developer. You've got these great ideas. You've shown me your wireframes of what you want to do with the product. It's fantastic. Let me just educate you a little bit about what it's going to be like to offer a product in a heavily regulated space. And so we feel like there's a lot of education that goes into that. And that's everything from, let me have the orange jumpsuit conversation because the way you've described this to me sounds like you're going to engage in unlicensed money transmission. So that's one extreme versus the, okay, we think what you're doing is great. The next step is to find a bank partner to help you get access into the payment systems, for example. What are they going to look for? In terms of their due diligence questionnaires, and really just setting people up for success to say, is the product design sound and compliant, and where can we make it better? And then, okay, what are those partners and key partnerships you're going to have in place, and what are those going to require? And that's, a conversation. And sometimes, it's helping the client think through, hey, do I really want to take on the payment function here? That's really not core to what I'm trying to do. Is there another company that I can leverage to do that? Can I go out and partner with a Stripe or someone else? And so I think that, I think what we do is I consider us kind of an idea crucible, right? So the raw idea or even a fully fleshed idea comes in for us to then take a look at it and break it down into, what are the possible paths forward? What makes sense for your business model, what you're trying to achieve? And then finally kind of, okay, what do we have to do to make that happen? So there you go.
Well, no, terrific. I appreciate that response. I like the idea crucible terminology as well. That's interesting. Keith and I, our bailiwick is executive recruitment, finding the right talent to propel your bank forward. And it occurs to me that in financial services, especially community banks, and we deal with community banks generally under 20 billion, sometimes under $1 billion, smaller banks that are really trying to grapple for that relevancy going forward. The technology leaders at these banks, I'd love to hear what you consider that hierarchy and how it needs to look going forward. Because a lot, what I've seen is CTOs are, sometimes, Erin, you mentioned like the X's and O's tech managers in a conversation we had, but there needs to be like an innovation driver as well. So I was just curious what your thought is on talent in this realm.
I mean, that's a great question. And I can tell you at our various community banking clients, we see talent kind of all over the map, right? So oftentimes within a bank, you're going to have your head of IT functionality or your head of, I don't want to say vendor management, but the people who really run the nuts and bolts of your bank's core operating system, and then your outward facing customer products and services and channels. So those folks are great, absolutely necessary. But, at different banks, we see different people who are taking a different role on, okay, we have what we have in place now. If we want to add our product or service, what is our internal process to evaluate that in terms of, is there customer demand? What's the revenue that we think we're going to generate? What are the expenses we're going to have to generate to make this happen? And so we see people sometimes internally within the retail product group or the commercial product group taking on that role of strategic planning, working hand in glove with IT. But more and more, we're seeing new roles emerging within the bank hierarchy of head of digital innovation or head of digital strategy. Especially post-COVID, I would say that all these banks on the roadmap had, it would be great for us to get to, where we could do all our account opening online, all loans that we could do through DocuSign, that'd be a great nice to have. Post-COVID with social distancing, it's a must have, and all those projects have gotten moved up on the roadmap. So having someone within the bank who can own the strategic thinking piece and then probably oversee the implementation, I think is becoming more and more critical. And I'm not sure you're going to find that talent strictly within someone who has a pure banking and financial services resume. It may take, reaching out to folks who've had different roles at different startups, different fintechs, different e-commerce providers, maybe leveraging talent. If you don't think you can develop internally, how do you leverage a targeted search to bring that external talent into the bank's environment? I think you're going to start seeing that more and more, especially as community banks need to understand and keep pace. I think a lot of community banks are like, well, we'll just offer whatever Fiserv says they can support or whatever Jack Henry says they can support. And they're starting to realize that may not bring enough to the table, and or not to speak out of turn, some of those products and services that the cores are offering aren't great and don't provide a great customer experience. So how do you position yourself to be able to bring in third-party products and services that can plug into the core, but then still give the user experience your customers are looking for?
So my thoughts on this, I come at it a little bit differently. The conversations that I always have with my clients, that I start with my clients when they want to, undertake a new project, go digital, do whatever, use whatever sort of buzzwords, that they want to use and aren't certain how they want to go do that. I always go back and say, what's your vision and what are the goals? And if you don't have anyone in your C-suite who can very clearly articulate what the vision and goals are for a digital transformation, for the embracing of technology, you're going to struggle in the creation and deployment of whatever it is you want to do. If you want to grow your existing customer base, that's one thing. If you want to offer better products and service to only your existing customers, that's another thing. If you want to, create a frictionless online only account opening, platform, that's something else. So you really have to figure out what the what is. And sort of move backwards. And part of that, I think, is, yes, you obviously have to have talent with technical expertise. But I think sometimes marketing expertise gets a little bit of short shrift. Design expertise gets short shrift sometimes within financial services. If you want to say, we'll hire developers to handle our UI, UX and the look and feel of everything that we're going to do. I think that's short-sighted. I think that, you want someone within your you can teach financial services. You can teach that math. Smart people can understand all of those things. But sometimes I think that FIs overlook people with other very, very valuable talent offerings like marketing and design thinking. And to me, it doesn't matter where you got that expertise. It doesn't matter if it was in, Walmart's e-commerce or, whatever it may be. A customer experience is a customer experience. And what is the real difference anymore between a customer experience on, shopping app of your choice and your bank? Like, come on, like everyone wants the same easy experience everywhere.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. You're right. And you do see some of our candidates are coming from outside of banking these days because of that point exactly. And Erin, one thing you had mentioned about, maybe looking internally for that candidate, that's a great idea, especially in the last 9 months, 10 months of COVID. There's a lot of technological and operations people that have stepped up and figured how to connect dots. Those could be the future leaders of some of these innovation functions if you empower them to do that. So those are both great thoughts. Keith, I know you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, just kind of following up on what Dara was saying. The genesis of a fintech relationship and understanding what you want to be. Sometimes they jump in and like, oh, I want to be payments. So really taking a step back and figuring out what's your strategy, what's kind of your plan. What advice would you give, and this is probably a question for both of you, to our clients who aren't in that fintech world yet? And there's not many. I know, Erin, you mentioned, 25, 30 banks, and that's, Brian and I agree. We always see the same names coming up. For the other 5,200 banks out there, so what's kind of step one in vetting the genesis of maybe I want to jump into that pool if I'm like a CEO or a board member? I would think step one is calling my lawyer, which is good for you and your business, but I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts.
So I'm a big advocate of, dipping your toe. Like, pick a process within your financial institution that like your staff hates, people complain about, that's a big pain, right? Like, where identify your most painful points, right? And then maybe that is, figuring out in a COVID environment how to open an account. Maybe like that's the most painful point for you because branches are closed and people don't want to come in. So how do we facilitate account opening in our virtual environment? And I would pick one, right? Like pick one at the beginning. If you're nervous about, fully committing. And then I would start there. But I always say, like, if you already have like good, effective processes, like there's no need to reinvent the wheel. Pick something that sucks. Like pick something that sucks for you guys right now. If it's account opening that sucks right now, focus your time and energy there, because whatever improvements you make, it's sort of like your internal PR, like, look at how much better we made this. And then you're making real impact for your efforts. And I think about, in terms of choosing and vetting vendors, there's lots of really wonderful industry resources where you can sort of, crowdsource and hive mind, things that have been really, really effective for people. I think about the community banking space. Like, if you don't know where to start, contact Alloy Labs. Right. Contact Jason. Honestly, like contact Jason Henry at Alloy Labs. They literally have a consortium of banks who work together to figure out what the best, groups of solutions to those types of problems are. And you've got, sort of like an outsource, chief digital officer and a bunch of other banks like it, where it's not competitive. I never believe that compliance is competitive. And work at it from there. And there's a million other organizations like it, but since we're talking community banks, I had to plug my friends at Alloy. So pick something. That's my advice. Pick something that sucks and start there.
which is great advice. And I think we always view the conversations around fintech as really falling into two different buckets, which is, what are we going to do internally within the financial services organization to either improve, offer a new product that's going to be to our existing customers, and those customers we hope to retain through the normal banking channels. I'll plug Alloy Labs. ICBA, the Independent Community Bankers of America, also has a great program and a lot of tips and practical advice around looking at fintech options for your institution. And that's one huge bucket of issues that are immediate to the community bank's needs and kind of strategic plan. If you are talking about jumping into the pool of the banks that we are referring to as platform banks or partner banks, that is a different conversation. And that conversation is, okay, are we prepared to be the financial institution partner with a company like Monzo or Chime or Square or a fintech? And what does that mean? That means a lot. So just on the payment side, if you're a community bank that has outsourced your card function, like you don't issue your own credit cards, you outsource to like First National Bank of Omaha or Commerce Bank to do it, you don't have some deep ties into the card networks right now, you're not actually a sponsor bank, that could be a big lift on the payments piece, for example, because right now, I will tell you, Visa has something called the Visa Fast Track program, and MasterCard has an equivalent program called MasterCard Accelerate, where they are working directly with FinTechs to really brainstorm. It's not necessarily an incubator, but it's more of a toolkit to get the FinTechs ready to launch. And part of that process is finding the FinTech a sponsor bank if they're going to need one, a partner bank. So if you are literally going to like elevate your role into something that's more than just a user of technology or an internal developer of technology to your own customer base, I think the three watchwords when you're even considering this strategically are talent, operations, and then what I'll call well, I guess operations covers infrastructure, but that third rail is going to be scalability and can you handle it? And I'll give you an example. One of the issuing banks for Chime, after they launched with Chime, I think within the first 4 months added 400,000 new Chime deposit related accounts, added $500 million in assets. And over the course of, a year partnering with that, the scale of what they were doing just jumped off the charts. And so that's a lot of issues that play into that, all the way from your capital requirements levels at the community bank, all the way to, do we have enough people in the payments group to handle this from a compliance and oversight perspective? When you're doing something that's more the partner bank route, you're actively overseeing these program managers. You're reviewing marketing materials. You're advising on their Reg E compliance process. You're doing a ton. It is more of a marriage than just a mere customer relationship or even a mere vendor relationship. And so a lot of banks, when they're figuring out, is this something we want to even get into, it's figuring out what has to be in place. And then the upside is what additional revenue, deposits that are going to be on the books. How are we going to make money off of these strategic partnerships with FinTechs? I just say there's an awful lot that has to be put in place that the bank has to address in order to do that. And if you're looking at the banks, we've seen a relative explosion in the number of partner platform banks, going from about 4 in 2007 up to more than 30 now. Those 4 who really were the original kind of innovators in this area were basically working with prepaid card programs, your Green Dots, your Blackhawks, and people of that nature to issue the prepaid cards and open loop cards. Well, that has just exploded. It's way beyond just prepaid or anything like that. And then on the flip side, and Dara may be able to speak to this as well, there's kind of the payment functionality, and it's a payment product or some kind of an account-like product, something that you would play a role in. There's also the flip side about the lending and the FinTech lending side. Are you actually going to be a lender involved with a FinTech that wants to offer, either small dollar loans or other types of loans to people? That comes along with a whole other set of risk issues, compliance issues, and oversight issues. So, conversation one, immediate, is what does our bank need to do to stay competitive and offer good products and services? Conversation two is, and are we going to think about making a leap into doing something deeper on the FinTech partnership side?
Right. So to just piggyback off what Erin said, it goes back to, what is your vision, right? Like, what is it that you want to do? Do you want to be, an originator of loans? Do you want to be the backbone for, online marketplace lending platforms? Do you want to be the web bank, right? Like, what is it that you want to do? Because whatever it is, those are very different paths. Those are very different sets of liabilities. Those are very different sets of regulatory concerns. And honestly, there's very different support, right? You need in those functions, different sets of agreements, different sets of considerations. So you got to know what you want. And that's not always an easy question to answer.
That's a deep question. Sometimes you got to lock yourself in a closet for like a day and figure out what you really want to be. But going back to what you were saying, Erin, we had a webinar back in July with Jill Castilla, Ron McDaniel, Patrick Sells, and Dara, your friend Jason Henrik. And it was a great webinar. And Jill mentioned the relationship with the FinTechs. It's a marriage. It's not a vendor relationship. You have to get to know the CEO, what their vision is, what they're trying to do. Plus, there's so many FinTechs out there from a risk standpoint too. How many of these FinTechs are going to be around in 2 or 3 years? Are they going to get gobbled up? Are you, jumping into a relationship with a FinTech that's not going to be around after 3 years? So Brian and I have heard from CEOs and clients about that type of talent that really understands the whole landscape of the FinTech world, is neck deep in it, knows the CEOs, goes to the conferences, and understands kind of who's the player, who's not the player. That, I think, Erin and Dara, is essential, right? To have that type of talent who can speak that language, but also bring that relationship into the bank's overall strategy.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's funny you mentioned that webinar because of the names you ticked off. Two of those individuals are our clients, so we're very familiar with their strategy and their thought process. And I think that's right. I think, I'll just say this. I think a lot happened post DoddFrank. So if we're kind of coming full circle on where financial services regulation is, a lot happened post Dodd-Frank with a lot of community banks having, more compliance obligations, just deeper concerns about the compliance issues. I don't want to say that necessarily put community banks or banks in general in the penalty box, but I think it did in terms of thinking and risk tolerance. So it's not a coincidence in my mind that post Dodd-Frank, you also saw the rise of the non-bank FinTechs. I think that was actually something that was going to happen given that banks moved into a more conservative position, while FinTechs were willing to push the envelope on a lot of stuff and continue to do so. And now in a lot of ways, I think community banks are in a game of playing catch up. And while the regulators, they're never going to be ahead of innovation at all, I think in the last couple of years in particular, we've seen some strides with the offices of innovation now being present at most functional regulators at the federal level. And then you've got a couple of states that have rolled out a FinTech sandbox concept, Wyoming being the first to do so, where the regulators are actually starting to engage more on a conversational level, and then also being a little more willing to vet issues in product design and idea, design phase before there's actual rollout. Now, I think we see a lot of that continue even under a Biden administration. I don't think the innovation piece is going to change in terms of how the regulators want to engage. But having someone internally who's keeping track of all that and really understands, yes, these are the players that are out there, someone who may not necessarily know all the FinTechs, but someone who can help evaluate and vet a FinTech, having that person internally is going to be key. And then it'd be ideal to also have someone who not only has that knowledge, but is keeping their thumbs on and their fingers on the regulatory landscape too, because I will tell you that the biggest conversations you have internally over new product or even new partnerships is compliance wants to know what their compliance obligations are going to be, while the sales people who want to roll out the product or the teams that want to roll out the product are like, why are you bringing this up? And so we often encourage banks, we talked about the chief innovation role or the digital strategy role. We also encourage banks to have something akin to a new products committee that brings together different stakeholders across the institution. It's legal, it's audit, it's compliance, it's IT, it's that innovation strategy role to really say, look, we've done the first cut of due diligence on this idea or this product or this vendor we want to engage in. Let's sit down at the table and talk about everybody's concerns before we move down the path. I think that really, really plugged in financial institutions aren't just letting that go through the standard vendor management path, although that's still important, but getting kind of stakeholder buy-in from all affected internal lines of business and divisions within the institution to really fully understand. Because I can tell you that if you get someone on board with the idea and thinking through the issues at the beginning of that process, absolutely invaluable to make sure the process goes smoothly from there on out. And that team also includes marketing. To Dara's earlier point is, it's great if you get a new product out there. If you get no customers who have any uptake on it or use of it, that's really not going to do your institution any good in the long run.
No, that's great, Erin. And what you were just talking about, Wyoming, I know they're calling it the Silicon Prairie now. And Brian, we were reading about Kraken, and that kind of brings me to Dara, what we were talking about right before we started this call, which is so much is happening: cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, digital assets, just FinTechs, and the government trying to keep up. And how do you strategize if you're a CEO or a board member when you really don't know what the rules are going forward? It's always fascinating to me, and that's why I love talking to lawyers. What do you do? I mean,
that's why Erin and I get paid the big
yeah,
bucks.
I know.
It is not new news that rules and regulations have lagged behind industry and technology. That has always been the case. It's the case in financial services, it's the case in healthcare, it's the case in all industries. So whenever you have innovative products and services that are trying to move the ball forward, you use the structure that currently exists within the environment that they operate. And to a degree, your legal professionals will help you do a little bit of predicting. Like, there might not be a direct rule on this, but I can tell you that this is what makes regulators cranky, that this is what, is going,
Right.
Conceptually, this is, UDAP is not they're very clear about, the things that they're concerned about. They don't want consumers to be treated unfairly. They don't want consumers to be treated deceptively. Don't abuse your consumer, right? Like they're not going to give you a bullet list of what sorts of conduct constitutes all of those things. But if you have someone who understands the landscape and looks at what's gotten companies into trouble in the past, you can do a fair amount of predicting about what's going to get you into trouble in the future. And, truth be told, we were talking, before we started recording, about some rulemaking that came out, October 30th. After 7+ long years, the CFPB finally issued rules under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. We've literally been waiting, like this statute was passed in the 70s, right? Like the 70s, and there's never been rulemaking written on it before. So while we had a rule, we had a law, we had the FDCPA on the books about, how debt collection companies were supposed to interact with consumers. For decades and decades, there was no rulemaking authority. Yet somehow an industry continued to operate and thrive. And it was like messy, but it wasn't impossible. The CFPB, it took them 7 years or so after gaining rulemaking authority over that to finally issue a rule. And it's still imperfect. I'll go on record. It's saying it's imperfect and doesn't cover a lot of the technology that we were hoping it was going to cover. And, even waiting as long as we did, it's like still behind, but it's like shiny and new. That doesn't mean that an entire industry of receivables management hasn't been operating successfully, quite frankly, for that whole time period. And I think that that's a good analogy to draw to, emerging parts of the fintech world now. If you're waiting to do what you want to do because you're waiting for rules, you're going to be waiting a really, really long time. And, don't do that. Just call up someone like Erin or I, and we can help you sort, we can help you sort that out. But that's the way our regulators work. Like that's the way laws and rules and regs are done in this country. And it sort of sucks, but it is what it is. And that doesn't mean you stop doing business.
Better to ask for forgiveness than permission, I guess, is that
only if you call Erin or I first and do it defensively, right? Otherwise,
right.
it becomes so much harder for Erin and I to ask for forgiveness for you.
Exactly.
Brian and I always say the first call of the CEO is probably to their lawyer. Thinking about
Sometimes
doing
we
this.
wish it was. You'd think that.
I would hope.
Yeah.
That would be my first call if I was the
You'd be
CEO, that's for
surprised.
sure.
You'd be surprised.
Brian, you had a question you wanted to ask?
Well, I don't know if Erin, did you want to chime into that point at all? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that we get very comfortable, especially when you're doing anything that could be categorized as bleeding edge. Our advice is not untethered from what we've seen previously and how we anticipate a regulator reacting to something. It's interesting because while there may not be a law or a rule or a reg specifically on point, I think that we have seen just the ability to advise by analogy, I think is super important, and what you've seen other people do where the missteps have been and kind of anticipating that. And a good example I'll give of that is, I can't even tell you, it wasn't 7 years like the FDCPA rules, but I think the prepaid card rule was hanging around for 2.5 years plus. And one of the big elements of the prepaid card rule that non-bank fintechs were looking at is, are we going to be subject to regulation need based on what we're doing? And now we have a little more clarity with that, and PayPal is actually pushing back on that a bit. But even though PayPal is having that argument about Reg E compliance, PayPal many, many years ago went with a modified voluntary Reg E dispute resolution process. So I think there is a way to, anticipate, hey, this reg may not apply to us today, but is it really the right thing to do from a fairness to the customer perspective to kind of sit on that technicality and say, oh, it doesn't really apply to us? We're, kind of divorced from the fact that if you're going to offer this product and you don't have a dispute resolution process, really, where does that leave you in terms of a customer satisfaction standpoint? And wouldn't you rather have, even if it's a voluntary dispute resolution process, something that is going to help the customers resolve their issues versus just saying, no, that's not our problem? I think the no, that's not our problem approach is what leads to people picking up the phone and calling the FTC, for example. And so that idea that, you think that it may not be a regulatory obligation directly on you, there is that pragmatic approach of should you address it. The other thing to understand, and this is what we do a lot of education over, is if you have a bank partner, understand the flow through regulatory obligations that flow through from the bank having that regulatory obligation to you taking a role. And you taking a role, for example, if you are onboarding the customer, you're going to have to do some of the KYC and CIP issues and vetting up front because you've voluntarily taken on that role. And what do you have to do in order to help your bank partner meet its regulatory obligations? That's a huge conversation about how far down do those regs roll in a bank partnership model, for example. And, we call that flow through regulation. And a lot of our clients will say, yeah, but we don't think that's our regulatory obligation. And say, no, under the law, it may not be. Under contract, it very well may be. So understanding some of those nuances, I think, is really important as well.
I would also just say that there doesn't necessarily need to be a very specific rule or regulation on the books that directly speaks to whatever act or conduct that we're talking about right now to create liability for a fintech. Yeah. Every state in which you might do business has some version of an unfair, deceptive business practices act that can always form the basis of, craftily pled theories of liability. Those are very broad, generic statutes, just like UDAP is. And a lot of the rules and regulations that Erin and I are talking about, there are no private rights of action, under them.
Right.
A regulator can slap your hand and, you can get into trouble with, the FTC or the OCC or the CFPB. But then there's the plaintiff's bar that's just sort of like hanging out to the side, waiting for you to do something that doesn't feel quite right and creating a theory of liability under existing, generic, unfair and deceptive trade practices statutes in whatever jurisdiction they feel like. And they're very creative. Plaintiff's bar is very creative. So when you look at it, it's not just about like, oh, well, technically, like I don't fit under Reg E. It's like, okay, well, if your counsel is telling you that something doesn't smell right, you don't just have to be worried about Reg E. You got to be worried about all of this other stuff because the look and feel of all of that is important. So, the conversations I have with clients, they were like, well, technically, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, that's correct. That's cute. Right? Like, that's cute. We're going to be dealing with this in another form of headache at some point. And until that regulator changes its mind and or does some additional rulemaking and doesn't, grandfather in all of your conduct and, you don't have, preemption and, you've got to do what is right. And you have to think about more than just the black and white of the specific rule or regulation that's in front of you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was curious. It was occurring to me as you were talking, the FDIC was trying to create a program to encourage community banks to engage with FinTechs, I believe, the FDI Tech program. Has there been any update with that? Are you familiar with that at all?
I have not been following that closely, but I do know that was one of the initiatives, and I'm hoping that they've had some success with that. I'm just not sure. I don't know. We're about to come into an administration change. It's going to have a lot of ramifications.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, I just, if we're speaking about regulatory issues more broadly, I had something that struck me that I read about last week, and Dara, you may be familiar. So let's just talk with the CFPB, right? Everybody wants to know who the new head of the CFPB is going to be. We now have a Supreme Court case that's kind of, said that person it can be removed after appointed by the president. So we're probably going to get some confirmation. Right, exactly. So CFPB, what's interesting is I don't think we can get too comfortable with the previous 4 years, because I believe right before the Trump administration started, CFPB the year previously had issued something around $12 billion in fines. In the past 4 years, it's levied $8. And when I say $8, I mean $8, not $8 billion, $8. So we've seen what some people may think is, a shift within the CFPB. I don't necessarily think that we're going to have business as usual from that dramatic reduction. If you are looking at these issues broadly, I think the CFPB probably starts ramping up its enforcement again, no matter who is the head of that bureau, to a certain extent. So understand that they are there, and why I kind of focus on them is, they're the ones that actually do have the jurisdiction over non-bank fintechs that offer financial services, right? So you've got your functional regulators, and of course, the new heads of those agencies are going to be important. Brian Brooks probably doesn't stay at OCC, even though he's been super innovative in pushing a lot of the crypto and a lot of the fintech payments-only charter work. I don't think those issues go away. I think we just want to see what kind of priorities are the new heads of these agencies going to have, right? So, and I think everybody's still, wondering, who's going to be in that conversation. All the communities bankers out there are probably worried that Elizabeth Warren is going to be appointed the head of some agency. I just don't know if that happens with the current makeup of the Senate, frankly, or the projected makeup. But I do think that even though there's going to be a shift, if we're looking at trends, consumer protection is going to be on the upswing again, most definitely, given the changes you're going to see probably at those agencies, CFPB, also given Maxine Waters and her role and her emphasis on this, at least in the House. I don't think we're going to see a radical, I don't think we're going to see someone appointed head of Treasury that's not going to also have this on their radar. And understand, we've got some Treasury reports that are out there about the importance of fintech innovation and the importance of banks, partnering with fintechs and bank technology as well. So I think a lot of the issues are going to be through lines. I think the question will be what agency development and enforcement priorities shake out once we get the heads of those agencies in place.
So you're saying Brian and I should focus on compliance talent for the next couple of years?
We already are.
That's a constant. I think compliance talent and/or compliance solutions, because I think a lot of the compliance talent nowadays has to be people who also know how to leverage reg tech effectively. I think those are going to continue to be in demand and important roles.
So one thing that I would just add, while Erin is right about what the activity level within the Bureau has been over the past 4 years, I will say that starting in August, so like right leading up to before the election, there was a definite and, in my view, obvious uptick in enforcement activity at at the Bureau. I personally had investigations that had been long dormant for years, like things that I hadn't heard about, all of a sudden started percolating in August and September. I actually did a podcast episode with Joanne Needleman from Clark Hill about, the enforcement activity that happened against Encore Capital Group and Midland Funding, in September. And we hadn't seen anything like that for years. And like, there was some, thought like, is Director, Kraninger trying to keep her job after administration change? Is it politics? Does the agency want to look like they're doing something for consumers, like leading up into November? Whatever the reason is I think if you'd been involved and you saw the uptick in pacing of activity since August, that 3-month time period is far more indicative of what I think we can expect, and then some, as opposed to the last 4 years. Now Encore went ahead and settled. So like, I think technically that settlement, came in like, so I don't know if it's it was like $15 million. Like it was not immaterial, and that they like squeezed that in right at the end of the Trump administration. But Erin is right. Supervision and enforcement is going to be far greater than it has been. I do still hold out a lot of hope for the future of the Office of Innovation within the Bureau. So I think all of that is good. There are still a lot of research initiatives being conducted. But if you haven't read DoddFrank lately, and you maybe like want to brush up on your UDAP a little bit, like just like buckle up. Like it doesn't, honestly, like whoever is put in charge, buckle up. Like I almost don't think it doesn't matter right now.
Okay, so Erin and Dara, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a terrific, educational, informative discussion, and I really appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Dara.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.